excited to be here tonight with my advisor, the one and only Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin. She is, I don't know the endowed chair of the name of it, but she is the professor of African Americans and Africana Studies at Columbia University, as well as a professor in the English department there. I always feel so incredibly grateful to work with her and listen to her, and I'm so lucky and happy for you all tonight to be able to kind of peek into the wisdom that she so gracefully will share with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, for coming to Book Culture, which is our neighborhood local bookstore. And when Mabel Wilson, who is the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and Kelly Jones is here, who is the chair of the Department of African American Studies as well, so the Department and Institute. When Mabel asked me where I wanted to do the first event for this book, I immediately said Book Culture. Support your local independent bookstore, always. And Book Culture supports us, and we just love seeing our community here. So thank you to Book Culture. Thank you to Margaret. When she asked me who I wanted to be in conversation with, I thought Margaret, who is a phenomenal graduate student, and I've worked with her both as an advisor and really fascinated by the work that she's been doing. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that work. And also, she's my TA this semester, and she saves me every single day, because I am that professor who's like, Margaret, what do I do? Like, what's happening with this computer? Or something like that. So thank you for being here in conversation with me. But especially, I wanted to be in conversation with her because this collection of essays, there are a couple of new ones, but some of them are essays that I wrote early in my career, and I wanted them to both reach back and stretch forward into new generations of scholarship, and Margaret represents that to me. So I'm going to read a little, and then Margaret and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to conversation with you all. And I think it's appropriate that I actually am going to read the very last essay, since I'm not giving anything away by starting at the end. But I think this is a good essay to, I'll share selections of it with you. Share here for the very same reasons that I wanted to be in conversation with Margaret. The title of this essay is Ancient Histories and New Worlds, Allison Janae Hamilton. Does anybody know Allison Janae Hamilton? Yeah, great. So Allison Janae Hamilton is an artist. Keep your eye out for her if you don't know her work already. A multi-talented artist who works in many medium and is just really gifted. She was a graduate student, MA student in our program in African American Studies, and then she went on to NYU, where she worked with the great Deb Willis, and then she came back and worked with Sanford Biggers, and she was an artist in residence at the Studio Museum, and now she's just internationally, she's just gaining all kinds of momentum. And so I wrote this essay and decided to close this collection with a new young artist who had also been a student, had also been my research assistant at one point, and then just flew beyond anything I could have imagined. So I'm going to read from the essay for Allison. Allison Janae Hamilton creates worlds. Her lush and luscious landscapes invite you to wonder as you wander. It is a world of sound and sight, a world of motion, of tall green pine, of water-rooted cypress, a world where masked women walk, skip, dance, or ride on horseback, where reptilian figures inhabit the swamp and pheasant the forest, and we share it all with them. She at once immerses you in both a prehistoric and postbellum past while projecting you into a post-apocalyptic, Afrofuturistic future. Her world is fully imaginative, ethereal, and beautiful, but also grounded in the realities of race, history, land, economic exploitation, and the impact of climate devastation. The landscape and history that inspire much of Hamilton's work is the dense pine woods of northern Florida. As scholar artist, she is daughter of this earth, and like her forebearer, Zora Neale Hurston, she knows it well. In ethnography and fiction, Hurston was one of the first to document and write about this part of the Black South, to offer first-hand accounts of the turpentine workers who lived in and traveled through the pine forest, tapping the trees for the pungent, gummy substance. As one of them told her, quote, "Turpentine woods is kind of lonesome," end quote. Hamilton builds upon this history to explore the relationship between the people and the land, between the natural world and generations of Black peoples, and between the exploitation of labor and nature. One senses, if not the lonesome, then the solitude, the singularity of inhabiting this space. And while we often place Black workers, enslaved and free, in the context of plantation slavery or cotton sharecropping, Hamilton expands our sense of the Black South, of the types of labor that Black people engaged in, and of the myriad cultures they produced. Northern Florida is dense and swampy, populated by a variety of bird and plant species and reptiles, snakes and alligators. In this way, they remind viewers of Louisiana, but it is unique even from that better-known space. Hamilton brings this landscape into the realm of the aesthetic, allowing it to give birth to her imaginings, and in so doing, making it a mythopoetic space, much like Gene Toomer did for the red earth and pine forests of rural Georgia in Kane in his genre-bending novel of 1923. And although she is in dialogue with these literary forms, Allison is primarily a visual artist, and in her work, she also engages and builds upon the work of others, like filmmakers Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust and Casey Lemon's Eve's Bayou. Both filmmakers showed us the deep, magical beauty of the very specific locations in the South, the Sea Islands and the Louisiana Bayou, and especially of the Black women who inhabit it, while also showing the limits of realism and linear narratives. For Dash, Lemons, and Hamilton, the land is as much a part of the culture as the food, the music, the spiritual traditions that it gives birth to. And Hamilton goes even further than they. Each exhibition is almost episodic, building upon the last, taking us deeper in the forest and the psyches of those elusive, sometimes masked figures who dance, walk, canoe, or ride on horseback. We view a canopy of trees, but we also encounter their actual trunks, smell the scent, and make note of the groomed horsetails that hang on the walls like a series of carefully curated whips. She invites us to participate in the magic making, to join her in the act of creating. Walking through an installation or accompanying her downriver on kayak, as the films allow you to do, one engages in an act of surveying. We may not know what has come before, but we have happened upon this landscape after disaster. There is the quiet that is disquieted. There is the stillness that is haunted. A fallen tree suggests something traumatic has occurred, a storm or worse. These are ancestral grounds. One feels their presence evoked by the ethereal figures who appear and then disappear as we wander past a still photograph or as a filmed figure gallops by. Sometimes we stumble upon the unknown, that for which we have no name, like the pink creatures, flowing and folded ochre blobs with tufts of horse's hair and pearl-adorned crowns. They are new life forms that could have emerged from the ocean's bottom or grown from the earth. Or the creatures, animal heads that seem to emerge from rather than mounted upon the walls, familiar yet like no animal we have ever seen. We bear witness to a new era of evolution. In this work, Hamilton sets us in the day after the end of the world, reminding us that all new worlds sit atop the ruins of old ones. And she offers us an invitation to join her as she builds it anew, ever mindful of the history that precedes us, ever open to the possibility that awaits our making.
Thank you for that. One of my favorite things in class is whenever a professor reads a passage from a poem or from anything, I find your voice to be so captivating. So I'm glad to hear that again. So I want to start talking about with the essay, which I think often we can think of as a very rigid and confining form, but one that I think, Professor Griffin, you find so much possibility in. I'm sure many of us have either written like a 5-paragraph essay, or you've been up into the late hours of the night writing the paper, or when you left university you were like, oh, thank God I'm finally done with ever having to write that again, right? But as we just heard, Professor Griffin, you're able to find, A Way to a Beautiful Freedom, as the title of your book suggests. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, how you have found the essay to open that space for you. What, authors before maybe helped you see that. Anything that, comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always loved the essay as a form. And I think before I sort of understood, writing the academic essay or writing, as I trained as a graduate student, because many of these are academic essays as well, academic articles. I read essays, collections of essays. So, James Baldwin is the first essayist I remember reading, but I read E.B. White, and, and I read the essays that were in, the New Yorker on the train going to school. And so I always liked the form of the essay because it was short. I could read it on the train. And I felt like I could grasp it. I could learn something. And it seemed like something that people who were literary writers but didn't write fiction used the form of the essay to write beautifully in. And this collection is named in homage, the first part of it, to a collection of essays that kind of changed my life in many ways, and that was Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which came out when I was in college, and really sort of showed me what the essay could be and do. And I've always felt it in her case, and then Black feminists use the essay constantly to be a kind of invitation to think with the writer. Like, come on, I'm going to think about this topic. I'm going to work my way through it. Think with me through it. And so, to me, it was just a very interesting form. You could think through a topic. You could try out something and leave it alone. We could try out something and then write something longer about it. It just was it gave you, it was sort of like a laboratory. And it was, like a short story, but in nonfiction form. So, yeah, that's why I always found them interesting.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think about, you say oh my goodness, Allison helps you, she invites you to those worlds. I think reading your book, and you're invited into those worlds through your language. I think there's a poeticism to the essay that I sometimes am not always able to find, but it's so present in yours, and especially hearing you read it out loud as well. So as you mentioned, Black feminists have been using the essay as a form for, decades at this point to think. And there's a whole section in your book, I think, and it's really dedicated to that. So I want to talk a bit about Black feminism's arc. And in your 2000 retrospective essay, you talk a bit about how you understand the task of the early Black feminists. One, it's an archaeological of finding old work to construct a tradition. 2, it's to create a vocabulary and framework for discussing. And 3rd, to theorize that body of work. And I'm curious to hear, how do you see, or how have we seen those tasks evolve over time? And what might you understand those tasks to be in the current moment?
Oh, I'm going to let you answer that last part.
That's not.
I don't do that anymore. So I think it was Mary Helen Washington who said it correctly, that for Black feminists, critics and theorists, they had to do it all at the same time. That other fields could kind of do the archaeological work of finding the text and then, building the vocabulary and then theorizing them. But that Black feminists were doing it all at the same time. So they were finding them, they were coming up with the vocabulary, they were theorizing, they were doing it, if you think about it, the first generation to actually call themselves Black feminists. I mean, they looked back and picked up texts that they called Black feminists, and picked up efforts to theorize it that they called Black feminists. But the first generation to do it is 1970s, right? So it's fairly recent. And the first essay, actually, right, that's published as a pamphlet toward a Black feminist criticism on Barbara Smith, when is that, Stephen, like 1973 or something? Is that early? And she's doing all of that at the same time, and doing it for other Black feminists who are emerging, trying to find a name for themselves and setting out their own project, assuming that it's not going to be recognized and legitimate by the Academy, right? So they're all doing it. And so that last question, what was it? The last part?
What might we understand that project to be today?
So what do you think it is? Because you're doing it.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
I think it's still some of the same. I think it's then grappling with what those who have come before us have said. At one point in the book, you also talk about, Black feminism is negotiating that subjectivity that has been put upon us. And I think there has been maybe some people who have taken that subjectivity up, those who've gone into, and really embrace maybe like a modern liberal subject. And I think the task now is really trying to parse through what might that subjectivity look like. Is there one possible for, that could lend to like a Black freedom in some ways? And I think really trying to be clear about what our politics are.
They really are.
Because it can get a little murky, I think, especially when you have, people who can lend into like a Black girl magic, and you have the Michelle Obamas and the Kamala Harrises. I think for some people that is a beautiful freedom. Then I think for other Black feminists, that's very clearly not. And trying to parse through, what is our freedom? Who are we accountable to, as you ask in the book? I think that's the task. And it's a tricky one. Yeah. Because the subjectivities that have been outlined in the Michelles or whatever are so seductive, I think. So trying to ask, how might we undo that seduction? Can it be undone? Does it need to be undone?
Right. Well, there's a question. Some people would say, why does it need to be done, right?
It doesn't. We're great. We in the White House now, like it's fine. And that's not a freedom that I think.
And for for those 1973 Black feminists, that was never the goal, right? So, I mean, I think you answered the question, right? That so that for every generation, there's a kind of looking back to, what were the goals? Like, did we reach them? What has it yielded? What kinds of freedom has it yielded? And then I think, there's also, I think about the work that you're doing, where you're looking at authors, in some ways you're looking at writers and activists that have been studied, but you're finding new things in them. Or you're looking at people who we haven't even thought of, that we missed out on, right? So there's a lot more work to be done, and you all are doing it. I see Irene here, and she's doing it, and so it's just really exciting. The project goes on. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think I'm addicted to Twitter, as I'm sure many people are, and one thing that I'll see often on like Black academic Twitter is that Black feminism is in crisis, and like there's no hope moving forward with it. But I think in one of the sections you talk about like the possibility that it comes from crisis, and I think through that crisis, through that conflict, that's what continues to push us forward to that beautiful freedom. And then recognizing that those conflicts have been there since the beginning. There's nothing new about that. And you talk about that in another one of your essays, conflict and chorus, and thinking about Toni Cade-Bambara's anthology, The Black Woman, which opened up space for all that dissent to live in one place. And that's productive and generative.
So I have a section called on conflict and on conflict and possibility. What is it called? I don't
Conflict and possibility.
Conflict and possibility. Yeah. So that crisis and possibility. So that in every crisis there is a possibility. That it's a way of sort of looking. I think that organizers do this often. Organizers do it all the time, and I think that we can learn from them is to look at a crisis and look for the possibility in the crisis. Like, okay, yes, or they've been planning for the crisis before it hits, right? And so that when the crisis hits, it's like, oh, here it is. We've been planning for this, and there's the possibility. The essay that you mentioned on conflict in chorus looks at another one of those books that's so formative for so many people. So In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, I have a funny story about In Search of Our Mother's Gardens being so formative for so many of us. But The Black Woman, which was Toni Cade's book that came out in 1970, some of you will remember it, wasn't necessarily, a Black feminist text. It was a Black woman's text. And some of the essays in there were feminist, and a lot of them were not. And I love that book because you see a generation of women trying to figure out, what are we going to be, right? And I love it because it's an anthology. I mean, what our colleague Jafari Allen calls the anthological generation, right? And the anthology wasn't about having a common voice. It was about bringing all these conflicting voices together. And some of them are calling for patriarchal protection. Like, Black women have never had protection. We've never been protected. We want some of that patriarchal protection. And the other one's saying, no, we don't want that, I mean, and you see that conflict happening in that book, which is what makes it so dynamic and so exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay. I guess we can turn to thinking about music and listening. So I feel like, in addition to being a lovely person to listen to in your writing, so much about what you talk about is music. And you have a whole section about learning how to listen, and how, that can lead us additionally to that beautiful freedom that you're talking about. And really simple question of whom do you think we might need to listen to today? I'll leave it there.
We turn that to you too. Everybody. Yeah. I think, I'm always asking younger people that, like, who should I, like, I usually ask anybody 2 questions. Who are you reading? What are you reading? And what are you listening to? And, each time I end up learning something or hearing somebody. And I remember the first time I was listening to, it was a young woman who first told me about Jasmine Sullivan like a decade ago, over a decade ago. I didn't know, and she's from Philly. I know all the Philly singers, but it was a young woman who told me, you really need to listen to Jasmine Sullivan, and I started listening to her for that. Or my college roommate, Sean, is here, and that's what we do to each other all the time. Have you heard this person? Have you heard that person? But it's the first thing I ask young people, who are you listening to? As much as I ask, who are you reading? So who are you listening to?
I have been, because I'm writing, I had a chapter deadline about 2 weeks ago.
You turned it in.
I turned it in, thank goodness. But because of that,
I can bear witness.
Yes, it was like, had to get my email confirmation and be like, y'all gonna give me my fellowship. But because of that, I try to listen to a lot of music that I feel reflects, like, what I call like the sonic atmosphere of the book that I'm reading. That way I can then mirror that it's like part of my like writing practice. So Alice Coltrane, I've been listening to a lot of her recently. Her song Going Home, I think I just put that on repeat. It's like 10 minutes long. So then I'm like, okay, I've been writing for 10 minutes again. And it's my uncle here, actually, he used to play Kathleen Battle's version of Going Home a lot. And so I always hear like, she's a gorgeous like operatic voice, and there's a bass clarinet in that. And I feel like when I hear Alice Coltrane play it, I can like, it mirrors that. And it's such a lovely, like meditative, ancestral thing. As my mother would always say, the ancestors are with you. So I feel like I can hear the ancestors with me when I listen to that. But then also the way that Coltrane bends it is so wonderful. And it reminds me of the girl characters in Toni Cape and Barr's Gorilla My Love, which is who I'm writing my chapter on.
Oh, that's fun. I did not expect you to say that, but yeah, Alice will put you in a different zone. I find when I listen to Alice Coltrane, and I listen to her often, but that it's hard for me to just come out and enter reality again, like enter like just walk the streets of New York again because she's so ethereal.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
it's like as otherworldly.
Right. Yeah. We've been listening to a lot of Samara Joy. And feel very proud that we were listening to her before she won the Grammy. Like we knew her win. It's so great to hear, like particularly in the jazz vein, to hear all these young women starting to get attention for a genre that has not been popular. So, Samara winning Best Grammy for Best New Artist, or Courtney Bryant, who's one of our students, getting all of this attention now, and then Brandy Younger, the harpist, who counts Alice Coltrane as a figure who's influential, was on Good Morning America. So like something is happening there. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay. So on the flip side of music, you talk a lot about like the possibilities of quiet and solitude, which you actually were talking about in class this morning as well. And so I'm wondering what possibilities you see interiority, especially a Black interiority, or a quietness. What possibility for freedom does that allow?
Wow. So this is one of those things where I had been trying to think through so thinking along with other writers about interiority and black people's sense of interiority. And there were other writers, like my dear friend Elizabeth Alexander has a beautiful collection of essays called The Black Interior that she published. And there were other people who, in both fiction and poetry, I think Gwendolyn Brooks has talked about, sort of tried to create a sense of interiority for her poetic subjects. But so much of Black life is, because, is seen as having to be kind of loud because of the violence that we are constantly up against, right? And then the theorist Kevin Quashie came out with a really beautiful book before his most recent one. Everyone quotes the most recent one, Black Aliveness, but he had a beautiful book that was called The Sovereignty of Quiet, that put into words and theorized something that I think many of us were trying to get at. And it was about interiority and quiet and stillness. And even in the moments of, I'll try to give some examples, bring it down to earth. Even in moments of Black resistance, he says, look at it again and you'll see stillness and you'll see quiet. So one of the images that he gives is, we're all familiar with the image of they're forgetting their names now, the Black athletes in the 1968 Olympics, where they're all, the three of them, Carlos Alonso, is that, like this, and it's a moment of Black protest, right? And we think about people in the street and, the chanting and this. And he says, but that's a moment of stillness, right? That the reason why it's that image that's so iconic is because it's a moment of stillness. And I think of it as a kind of necessary prerequisite to any kind of, real resistance. There's a requirement of a kind of quietness and a nurturing of interiority and the contemplative self. And Alice Coltrane is very much about the contemplative self, right? And so I've always been drawn to those moments in the arts, in literature, in music. I have an essay in here that's many of these essays were previously published in really obscure journals. And if you look for them, you can find them elsewhere. You can't find them together. But there's one that was not published before, and it's on the singers Sarita Wright, Minnie Riperton, and Denise Williams. And it's on a kind of quiet aesthetic in Black women's voices. When we come to think of like the sort of popular Black singer as being Aretha, right? And being Bessie Smith and the Blues Shouters, we forget that there's also this other line, this other lineage, from Billie Holiday on, that is also this quiet aesthetic too. And so I just want to, I think I'm always interested in calling our attention to the quiet aesthetic as well.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
It reminds me, Jessie Norman, another opera singer that I love. I think she's seen as somebody who's so loud, but often when you watch her performances, after she's finished singing, she has this like deep moment of interiority, and she's so quiet, and I feel like she just has to take in like what beauty she just produced for the audience, and it's just always so fascinating just to take that in with her, and then she like breathes through, and you're like, oh.
So true. Right, those performance moments. Deirdre Harris Kelly has done. Did you ever write that piece? There's that beautiful photograph of Billie Holiday before she steps on stage, backstage, right? Yeah, I heard you give a talk about it, and there's a photograph of Billie Holiday in a white. It almost looks like a bride's gown. It's a white strapless gown, and maybe she's at Carnegie Hall or something, but she's backstage before she steps on stage, and it's just that kind of moment. And you're thinking, like, what is she thinking? She's gathering her thoughts. She's kind of she's having that moment before she goes out to greet the audience, right? And it's very similar. And so I'm very interested in those moments in the visual arts, in the music, and in the literature too. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It reminds me of I feel like that's the first essay I ever read by you was when Melindy sings. And I think, we think about how you argue that, you see Black women's voices at these moments of like, wherever the nation is in crisis, there's a Black woman who's presented to sing, and that voice is going to nurture, and heal and whatever. And you think about, what interiority and moments of quiet did those singers need to have before they went off to do.
And what was the intention? I mean, I'm glad you brought that essay up, because that's probably my most well-known essay, and it's one of the reasons, like, this collection, like, there are friends and students and sister friends who are responsible for me putting this together, and they were insistent that essay be here. But I think where you're right is that you wonder what those women, what their intention was, because that essay is about the uses to which their voices were put. And everybody put their voices to, presidents of the United States used their voices for something, and Black male musicians used their voices for something, and writers and poets used their voices for something. But what were they thinking about the use of their voice? What was Marian Anderson thinking in 1939 when she stood there? We can find out, I'm sure she said, but she had to have a moment of interiority with all that hate that was coming at her before she stood there and, changed the country, singing at that moment. Yeah.
There's so much we gotta write about and think about.
Yeah, you all can do it.
Well, in regards to that, how do you tune in and tune out to find your own moments of interiority? In relation to your writing practice, or just living life?
That's a really good question. So I need quiet. I sometimes need to get out of my space. I just recently gave 3 lectures, and life was 3 lectures in a row, and life is very hectic, and what I found very helpful was to just go away to a place that was different and quiet and removed from my normal life for 2 days at a time, where I could just devote to doing that. And when I can't do that, walking. There was an article that was in the New Yorker recently. I don't know if anybody read it. Those of us who walk, this, right? You know that walking is part of writing, right? And this article talked about, scientifically, that walking helps the brain function in a way. But so walking for me, I am so grateful for parks in New York, because they are responsible for almost everything that I've written since I've been here. If I'm blocked, a good night's sleep and walking, both of those things that quiet the mind, are necessary for me to and for me, it's interesting. I know that I can get there with a quieter mind from walking, if I can get to the end. Like, usually the end comes to me, the last sentence comes to me before anything else. And then I know what I'm reaching for.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know the beginning, I don't know the middle, but I know that that's where I have to go. And that sometimes comes to me after a walk in the park. Yeah, but quiet and sky, something about the sky, like being able to see the sky helps me too. What about you? You're in the middle of writing.
I know, that's so fascinating. I feel like I never know where I'm in. Like, my writing process is a very like murky tunnel. Like, where am I going? But I think for me, like, writing is a tool of thinking, as we say in the writing department at Columbia University. And I think I really have to write it out to be like, what the hell am I even trying to say? Yes. And then I'll find that endpoint. And then I have to, like, okay, how can I communicate this in a way that makes sense to others? And then I have to have some music playing. I think that's my sky, is the music.
Sky is the music.
Yeah. Because that helps me kind of settle in, and find that like meditative space that I feel like, you talk about in here, in the interiority.
Whatever gets you in that sort of flow space that you need. Yeah.
And then I like to read. Like, I'll read Jamaica Kincaid before. I find her prose really beautiful, even if it's like very angry. It's like gorgeous. Yeah. And then after I read like a piece of literature that I love, I can be like, okay, I want to settle into this. Yes. And try to mirror some of their beauty if I can. Not always very successful at it, but that's what I do.
I mean, I think it's partly what you find out. I like that idea too, that sometimes I don't know what I'm writing until, like, writing to me is about the question, right? And so I don't know what I have to try to write it in order to find out what I need to know. Right, and then I'm like, oh, I need to know this. I don't know enough about this yet, but I wouldn't know it until I tried to write it in the beginning.
Well, it helps you find the holes and all the gaps, and it's like, okay, gotta keep going. Keep going. Keep going. One thing that we talked about a few months ago, you took me out to lunch, and you said I had to make space for writing in the work. And I'm curious to hear about how you make that space, and then also how you sustain your curiosity to be able to keep the work going.
How do I make space? That's a yeah. Sometimes sometimes I'm good at it. Sometimes I'm not. Life happens, and it gets in the way. Administrative responsibilities happen. But I know that I feel out of balance if I'm not trying to work on something. Like, I at some point I feel like, I need to be trying to write something. So the curiosity, I think, is just in some ways a part of living, and these pieces are all different. So there's different kinds of curiosity. So there's some pieces in here that are very academic, and because I have a kind of academic question or curiosity, or I've read something and I want to be in a conversation. I think I have something to contribute to a conversation, but not everything in here is academic, right? And so sometimes the curiosity is driven by something else. I'll go see Allison's work and be inspired by it and want to say something about it. And it's not necessarily, I want to engage it with words. So that's different from the academic pieces. Or I'll get so angry at the ways that I think people are using things that I care about or people that I care about as political pawns, and I feel like I need to say something, right? And so there are a couple of pieces in here that are just op-eds. That's what they were driven by that. Like, don't use Toni Morrison like that, or don't use black girls like that, or and so there are pieces that are that way. So the curiosity isn't always a scholar's curiosity or an academic curiosity. It's a curiosity about the world, which is a kind of I think a way of living, a way of life, you know. And sometimes the curiosity doesn't go away. It's the time to address it. So as you'll see, like in class, a lot of times I'm just like, well, you all see, especially the graduate students, I'm like, here's a topic for you. Here's a paper. You should write a paper on this, or here's something for you to think. Maybe you might want to think about it because I can't think about it, or I don't even have the talent to think about it. But it's always kind of there. Yeah.
It's like an urgency, right? A necessity of this needs to be thought about. Right. It needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and you don't think about it. And I always think about ideas. There's a book. My husband gets so frustrated with me because he's like, "Yeah, Farah, I know what you're talking about." Like, because I'll be like, that book by that woman. He's like, "Yeah, I know that book by that woman." But there's a book. There's an author who wrote a book that I really didn't like, and she got a lot of attention for it. And then she wrote another book that I thought, I agree with that. Anyway, I think ideas are just out there. They're just kind of out there, and they're available, and they want to be expressed. They really want to be. They want to be born. And they'll sort of tap you on your shoulder and they'll be like, Margaret, like, you're the one. I think you're the one. And you'll be like, oh, maybe I'm the one. Okay, I'll think about it. And you'll do a little work and then you'll put it down. And then the next thing you know, somebody down the street will have done it. It'll be the same idea. Yeah. Because I feel like the idea is like, okay, I tried to come through you.
I'm not going to go for somebody else.
So I'm just going to go find somebody else, right? Like, or maybe it's just of the moment that we're living in, right? So I feel like they're not my ideas. They're just, and everybody would do them differently, right? You would do it differently because it's going to come through you and all that you bring to it in a different way, right? So I can't get upset because it's not my idea, and so even when everybody gets to this point where you're like, oh God, I had that idea and somebody's already written about it. They've already taken it. Yeah, we all get to that point. And then you look back on it and you're like, no, that's not what happened. Not at all. Right?
Yeah. And I think that idea of, somebody already did this thing, I can't touch it, is so counterintuitive to the way that I understand knowledge and progress to be made. Is that we have to work with one another. Exactly. We have to build on top of each other. Right. Otherwise, what we finna do? Just
exactly.
And it's so individualistic in a way that we don't need. It's not productive.
Right. Not productive at all.
Yeah.
At all. Yeah. So I think we have to stop.
Yeah.
That's what they told me, right? Do we have to stop?
Questions from the audience?
Questions from the audience. Yes. Yeah. Okay. See, we're good. Yes.
Oh, are we first one?
Yeah.
Thank you. Buying a mic. Oh, okay. I usually don't need a mic, but okay.
We need it for the camera.
For the recording.
Okay. I think I know the author you're talking about. She wrote a book on magic.
Yes, so it was Eat, Pray, Love was her first book that I didn't like. But then she wrote Magic. Yes, that magic one. Magic. I love that book. It's so good.
And
yeah.
You described it well.
Yeah.
Farah.
Yeah. No, it's not. You don't have.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Okay. I get it. It's all a performance. I'm thinking about art. I've heard you talk a lot on the visual art, obviously, on visual arts. And I just want to hear more of it after you reading that piece.
Yeah.
And the cover of your book, obviously, so beautiful, Lorna. So if you could just talk a little bit, I've heard you talk on Bearden and Circe, and, it's so beautiful. I wish you would write more on art.
Says the artist.
Yeah. Well, I just love hearing you speak about it.
Well, thank you. So that could be a chance to talk about the construction of this book, actually. So I've learned a lot about seeing from you. This is my friend Deirdre Harris Kelly, who's a visual artist. And I love walking through shows with you because, you know, I have a section here learning how to listen, but I've learned how to see with you a lot. And I had a section in, you know, when I was pulling this together, again, I had these wonderful graduate students over the years and research assistants, including your child, Elizah Kelly, who's now a professor at Yale, was one of my early research assistants on this. And they gathered lots of stuff that I've written over the years. This is about a third of the essays that they pulled together for me. So there was, at one point, there was a whole section of things I'd written on visual arts, and there could have been a section on learning how to see. And the only piece that made it in the final collection was the piece on Allison. So right, there were two pieces on Bearden, and so maybe in another collection. So what, you know, I think it's just, I mean, some artists I'm just, you know, interested in. I'm curious about them, but with Allison's work and with the work on this cover, this is a Lorna Simpson. And Lorna, I didn't write about, but I do write about Lorna in an essay that I write about the critic Cheryl Wall, the late Cheryl Wall. I write a little bit about Lorna, about this piece. But I don't write about this piece in this collection because I didn't want to use it like an illustration, like, you know. But I love this piece. And what happened, in some ways, it resonates with what I said about Allison, because I don't know if anyone saw this show. It was up at, was it Hauser and Wirth? Hauser and Wirth down in Chelsea. So I went to the gallery 3 times when Lorna, and you can look it up in the Times. The Times did a great piece on that show. So it was new work, and it was all blue. And they were huge. They were huge. And I remember thinking, some of it was like, again, it was like some of Allison's work. It was like, is it climate change? Is it the day after disaster? Like, what is it floods? But it was so immersive, you know, and I just felt so compelled by it and wanted to live with it. And I felt these figures were like just beckoning me from some. What was so interesting about this figure is, okay, she looks like those ladies from Ebony and Jet that we grew up looking at, right? So on the one hand, she reminds me of my past, and yet she seemed to be beckoning from some future too. You know, like, come on. And so I think that the and the blues were just so intense, just like the blues in those, the various colors of blue were so intense in that show that I just felt compelled to go back again and again and again. And often I'm trying to figure out what it is that, on 2 things, how did the artists do what they did to make me see things the way I'm seeing them, the how, and then to step back and say, okay, what does that mean? So the how and then the what does it mean is how I think about it. Great question. Yeah. Other.
Hello, Dr. Griffin.
Hello.
So I have a question for you with regards to the essays that did make. Hi, I'm Stephen. And I have a question about the essays that made it into the book versus the 2/3 that didn't, and how you see them living together now that this exists. How are they speaking to each other to you?
Oh, wow. The essays that didn't make it versus the ones that did, and how. So some of them didn't make it just because they weren't that good. Like, I looked at them, you know, and I thought, well, no. A lot of them, but they were, here's a perfect example. Maybe I thought I was going to write a book about something, so I wrote 2 essays about 2 completely different subjects, but the same theoretical, right? So there was a point where I was interested in protection, what I call the promise of protection, that Black nationalism and that Black thinkers offered to Black women, the promise of protection. And I wrote an essay on Malcolm's promise of protection, and I also have an essay on Du Bois's promise of protection. And initially I had, and Du Bois's promise of protection was published in a political science journal, because I've been very fortunate in my career. I published in all kinds of disciplinary journals, right? So initially I had both of them. I had the Du Bois because I thought, and then finally when you have to cut things down, and Norton's like, no, you're not going to have a 1,000-page collection. You don't even want to do a collection. So you're not going to have something's got to go. And I thought, well, Malcolm's promise of protection speaks more to readers right now than Du Bois's does, because it was all that 19th century American Negro Academy stuff, Anna Julia Cooper. Yeah, so, only the real geeks would be interested in it. So that one went out, right? So if it looks like there was going to be some repetition, I moved it out. And some of them, I think, do live together, like I imagine I would love to do a visual arts piece. Or someone else said to me, I do a lot of tributes to people. Like in this one, there's a tribute to the late Al Roboteau, right? So he's the only one that I left one of those kinds of tributes in. But I do a lot of tributes to colleagues, particularly colleagues who have passed, or if they're retiring or something. And so I can imagine a collection that would just be like those kinds of tributes to my colleagues. And so, you get one here, but I could do, like Baraka has a book, I don't want this one, but Baraka has a book, beautiful book called Eulogies. All the eulogies that he's done, right? It's a really beautiful book. So something like that. So I see them as kind of living together in that way, that this feels like a sort of taste of the range. And then there are those other ones that are, a little more obscure, maybe. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Should I wait for the mic or should I?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just had a question about memory, because I guess I'm thinking of the Wrestling Till Dawn essay. But what I love about this book, is that memory is sort of a looking glass that we can kind of appreciate the power of a story, whether it's a fictional story or a song or how does the power of memory function as a way of reading and listening? I guess I relate to that as far as your descriptions being an avid reader and as a young girl. How does memory have to go on? I'm not read about it. But I love hearing you speak about that.
Another future amazing scholar, Irene Ross, so remember her name as well. So there, the essay that Irene referenced is one of those essays that I'm really grateful that this collection exists for that essay, because it's an essay called Wrestling Till Dawn or something. which is a reference to that biblical wrestling till dawn on becoming an intellectual in the age of Morrison. And it's a reference to, is it Jacob who referenced the angel, who wrestled the angel till dawn? And I'm glad it exists because I wrote it for a publication that I feel like very few people will ever read it, and I put a lot into it. So I like wanted some other people to get a chance to see it. And it's about kind of coming of age with. It's about an intellectual relationship with the works of Morrison, and it is about memory, and about and I think it's sort of it's a story. The way that I try to tell the story is for those of us who are readers. Our relationship to the authors we love and the books we love are as passionate and like as dramatic as all the relationships we have, right? Like you stay up with them and you read them, and then you grow and you change and you fight them, and you're like, I'm done, and I found another person who I like even better than you, and then you're like, oh, but now I'm more mature and I appreciate you more, and so and that's basically what it is. Like Morrison, blew my mind and changed my life, and then I became a feminist, and Alice Walker was more important to me. And what's wrong with you, Toni Morrison? Why do you kill off all your women? And what's wrong with you and these problematic men? And I'm more of a feminist than you are. And then Beloved came out, and I'm like, oh my God, And so it's it was remembering all those versions of myself reading her over the years before I ever knew her, right? And wrestling with her, and struggling and not understanding, and who I think that as readers and as writers, I think it's Baraka who says this in one of his books. He says, I'm going to get this wrong. There's something like, he who writes this book shall never read it. And it's sort of like, either I'm never going to read my own book, or once I'm finished writing it, I'm so different that even if I read it, I'm not going to be the person who wrote it. And that's sort of how I feel. Like, when you read a book, on the other side of reading it, you're a totally different person. Just like when you write it, you're a completely different person. And that's what the Wrestling Till Dawn is. So I like those kinds of essays where, and those are different from the academic essays, where you can wrestle with the memory, right? And I think that my last book tried to bring those two things together, tried to bring the sort of academic critic that I am together with the storyteller who was trying to come to terms with memory and reading together. Yeah, it's a great question. There's a hand back, all the way back here.
I'm thinking about ways in which great art kind of ripples the way that people that encounter it almost understand it. In recent memory, I guess it's Simone Lee's work at the ICA Boston, and also Autumn Womack's convening of her Toni Morrison symposium in Princeton. But I want to ask you particularly how you see your writing in this book, how you want it to ripple or shape the world of the readers that they inhabit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, how I want to see this book shaping the readers, the world of the readers. Well, one, I hope that it will make some people think about things they might not have thought about, right? I hope that it will introduce them to some ideas that they haven't been introduced to, or some thinkers or writers or artists that they don't know, that would be great. If you pick up one of the books or you go see an exhibition, and even if you disagree with me, oh gosh, she was so wrong. But you have to go see it to know I was wrong. And you have to read it to know I was wrong. So if you do that, then that would be wonderful. I would hope some young reader would stumble upon it somewhere just because they found this cover so compelling, right? And they might pick it up and say, oh, I thought this book was about the woman on the cover, but this all this boring stuff, but oh, she does talk about this. Because I did that with so many books, right? And so in that way, I think, you put stuff out in the world, you don't know what life it's going to have. You have no idea. So I don't know what it's going to do, but I hope that it'll just strike some curiosity. It'll make some people curious. It's funny, I think about how In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, what it did to me. One of our students who recently finished a thesis was writing, she was in the archive at in Emory, and she, it's so embarrassing, but I'm glad she shared it with me. So she was in the archives at Emory going through Alice Walker's papers, and she sent me a photograph of a letter that I wrote Alice Walker in 1984 when I was a college senior. And like, oh, Miss Walker, this book changed my life, and I want to be a writer, and I'm going through such a hard time right now, but thank you so much. And you know exactly what I was going through, Sean. You were my college roommate. But thank you so much for this book, and you've shown me this, and blah 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 blah. And then I was telling one of my former students, like, can you believe she had this letter was in the archive? And she's like, oh, I didn't tell you. She said, I found one the same year from Elizabeth Alexander, the poet. So that's what we made. Like Alice Walker, when she wrote that book, couldn't have known that these girls in college were going to be not only like reading it, probably, but it became their Bible. Like, I don't expect to become a Bible, but it can do all kinds of things. So I don't know. I just hope that maybe spark some curiosity, make people read or listen. Listen to, maybe they probably know Minnie Riperton's song because it's everywhere, but they might not know Sarita Wright. So go back and listen to Sarita Wright. Or what they might find out when they read this is that Solange was listening to Sarita Wright when she did A Seat at the Table. That she felt that she needed to hear those voices when she was making that music. So that's what I hope. That's a good place to end. Okay. Thank you.
I know.